Welcome to this very special episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in The World According to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here as always.
You're welcome. Welcome. This is the 44th episode we are doing, and we have traveled a long way, Irina, bringing a lot of perspective uh, about the world to the world, Irina. So let's dive into the big topics today, several big topics today. Let's talk about Air India tragedy. Let's talk about that one. Happened very much here in India. So tell us what do you get of this whole thing? What do you think? What was behind the Air India disaster in terms of tragedy? It's a tragedy. Investigation still on, but how do you look at it? This whole thing from that part of the world, the business part of it, the impact on Boeing, and also in politically and several other parts.
So there's several factors. First of all, Air India, the airline, has been under heavy criticism for unsafe practices. However, that does not explain uh, the Boeing element, and Boeing has had, separately from Air India, has had multiple unsafe incidents and unsafe landings and disasters over the past couple of years. There's been attempt to hold the company accountable, but it was recently canceled in the United States. The Justice Department investigation was put to a prosecution, criminal prosecution was put to an end. I'm sure there'll be private lawsuits, but that's a separate story. And from what I gathered, the pilot did everything possible to do what was doable under the current circumstances. The very strange thing, however, is that apparently right before the crash, the pilot was sending distress signals saying that nothing was working, not even the intercom, nothing. So that speaks to a systemic failure that was not caught before the plane took off, and there were several theories about what may have occurred from from a bird engaging with the flight, to technical issues of various sorts, to a confluence of factors. But with the recovery of the black box, we may soon be able to get some answers. At the same time, other theories proliferated, particularly after it was found that a Turkish company linked to some concerns related to the Kashmir attack apparently relocated hundreds of employees to Ahmedabad, the city where the accident occurred, just a month before the attack. Whether or not it's a complete coincidence, unrelated, remains to be seen as well. What's also worth noting is what happened after the attack. I'm not talking about, of course, the recovery of the bodies, the single individual who happened coincidentally to be in the same exact seat that another individual who survived a previous disaster also inhabited. But I'm talking about two incidents involving Air India flight. One flight had to be diverted because of a bomb threat days after the tragedy occurred. It was flying in from Thailand, I believe. And another flight had to be redirected back after technical issues in the air. So it's an amazing series of coincidences, even with all the criticisms of Air India, and the bomb threat obviously had nothing to do with the safety issues. It was obviously a targeted incident, and it's not clear what happened with it. Was it a hoax? Was someone trying to get their 15 minutes of fame in light of the attention that Air India was getting, or was it psychological pressure from malevolent actors trying to capitalize on the paranoia and the fear in light of the recent developments. All of that remains unclear. Um, so the investigation is ongoing. It's hard to say what is the actual cause, but hopefully that will be uh, found. So far, none of the Indian leadership has made accusations of terrorism or any sort of criminal activity, which is a hopeful sign that that it was just that a huge tragedy, which unfortunately resulted in the deaths of over 270 people, but nothing more than that, and people can continue to fly safely otherwise. But if there is anything suspicious, it will hopefully come out um, with the investigation.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. And we will have to wait for the investigation to happen. But what about on the larger impact, business-wise, on Boeing
Sure.
itself? Do you think? Do you think people will look at much more closely at Boeing and the way it dreams, Dreamliners, and all these things? It is coming into a lot of news and not so positive news, all negative news.
It is true, and it's not just the planes that have been the problem. If we recall the space issue where Elon Musk had to get involved in recalling the two astronauts back to the states, that too was had a Boeing footprint all over it. And the problem is there's been a severe criticism of business practices by Boeing, accusations of cutting corners in safety testing for profit, um, essential corruption on the leadership level, bonuses, and high salaries, despite the series of incidents that clearly are linked to technical issues and mismanagement. Tragedies. Flying used to be the safest way of traveling, despite the often sensational nature of occasional incidents. Now, with Boeing suffering a series of recurring incidents, many people are starting to question that. And Boeing is one of the dominant US companies on the market. Um, so far, US has not reconsidered moving its business to other companies, but the truth is Boeing has very few real competitors, and monopolizing all business in the hands of its one or two other major producers would not necessarily solve the safety issues. In fact, it could profoundly contribute to the same sort of thing happening with other companies. If nothing else, US and other major airplane producers need more competition, not less. But there needs to be a stricter oversight. There needs to be clear investigations and accountability, and lobbying should not put an end to criminal investigations into very concerning business practice. Moreover, the reputational damage from something like that should be unavoidable, but due to the series of geopolitical developments, we've seen that the story is already being pushed into the background, and only the lawyers for the families are likely to be closely following the matter in the weeks to come. Moreover, the blame is being placed on Air India due to its independent reputation and the fact that that it was a Boeing plane that went down for unclear issues seems to be downplayed by the media, despite the fact that it's obviously a chair on the top of a long series of critical concerns. I am not sure that the public outreach is going to be sufficient to really have a major impact on the Boeing business, particularly given how how it's one of the major remaining companies involved in this business. The only thing that I think could push Boeing to do better, aside from the government taking an interest, is actually advancing the success of newer competitors and new companies entering this market. The more companies are looking to produce better, more functional, better designed alternatives with better management and lower costs, the more pressure there's going to be on Boeing to perform better and to deliver better results. Right now, because it's one of a quasi monopolistic field with very limited competition, there is really no incentive to do better, because even if there's a lot of public criticism, it's not like people have a choice. And when you are buying a ticket to fly somewhere, it's not like you are going to based on whether the plane was made by Boeing or by somebody else. I mean, some people can have that luxury, but most people are looking for the cheapest possible tickets and convenient timing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Isn't it ironical, Irina, that we are trying to reach Mars and to other places, but we are not safe in our own skies? In spite of so many decades of flying and everything else, we have to just look at how it all pans out. Let's look at other stories here, and the big one is the Iran-Israel escalation conflict. Where is it going, and where does it look to be going? Will Trump, join this? Means what does it mean? I may do it, I may not do it. The president of United States telling about getting involved in attacking Iran.
Now, the context to this issue is very simple. Iran was on the verge of developing a nuclear weapon, and unlike many other countries that have responsible practices against nuclear proliferation and the use of nuclear weapons, Iran has profoundly undercut public trust by very openly threatening to attack Israel with nukes. A nuclear war would obviously be a disaster for the entire region and not just those two countries. So Israel decided that to save lives, it would take the preemptive step of degrading Iranian military and nuclear capacity to the extent that it could independently of US involvement. The situation has gone much more seriously in a few days. Turns out that Iranian air defense was practically non-existent. It could fire at will at Israeli civilians, but not defend its own territory. Moreover, due to the miscalculation of the Iranian leadership, who listened to Israel's reassurances that it would not attack before the scheduled sixth round of talks with the United States, some of their senior political staff and nuclear scientists and IRGC command ended up being struck down by Israel and losing their lives, only to be replaced by others who also almost immediately got killed. So this is also a massive counterintelligence failure by Iran. Israel had planned the separation for 20 years, but waited for the time and for the diplomacy to have a chance and for sanctions to have a chance, but nothing was changing. And the talks with US were not going anywhere, and we were basically wasting time, which Iran was using to its advantage to advance its nuclear ambitions. Israel during this time managed to build a drone base at the heart of Iran, similar to what we've seen occur with Operation Spiderweb between Ukraine and Russia, and essentially had a fairly strong penetration of the country that allowed it to gather exceptionally accurate intelligence, which translated into surgical military strikes that both successfully dislodged many of its targets and avoided extreme civilian casualties. Not that there weren't any, but they were, quite obviously proportional to the nature of the situation. Unfortunately, Iran brought all of this upon itself, and despite multiple calls from Trump and Europe and other countries to dismantle the program and return to the tables, refused to do so. Trump only the other day called for the Ayatollah Khamenei to give up, to capitulate, which he refused to do. And this is after Trump essentially saved his life by pressuring Israel not to kill him, despite the fact that Israel has his exact location and even in hiding. Uh, the most recent statement from the administration, aside from Trump's strategic ambiguity or his own usual trolling about uh, the fact that he could make the decision last minute, is that the senior US officials are preparing for a potential strike in the next days. Now, that could be nothing more than having a plan, because if Trump does decide to do it, you don't want to end up in a situation where you have to scramble last minute for a decision like that. So they should be prepared, even if he does not go through it. But it also seems that Trump is seeking to avoid US involvement as much as possible and to try to salvage the deal, seeing the current situation as significant diplomatic leverage and pressure on Iran. In fact, just earlier today, Trump said that Iran is looking to hold a meeting with the White House and that it's going to happen fairly soon. He had also talked about sending Witkoff and other senior officials for potential renewal of negotiations, whether about de escalation or the return to the official rounds of talks. It's not clear. But it's also obvious that Iran is not giving up easily, despite the fact that it has suffered a significant military and reputational blow. Why that is could be linked to the extremist ideology that prefers um, uh, to suffer heavy casualties than to admit defeat. It could be based on the fatalistic element of the Khomeiniist ideology that essentially leaves a lot of what happens to chance rather than to planning. And it could also be that Iran is counting on Trump to save them for the sake of his prospective Nobel Prize. After all, if Trump manages to eke out a deal, even if the deal ultimately fails, at the moment he will look like a hero who, on the one hand, appeared to be pro-Israel and backing Israel operations, um, had contributed with the intelligence and logistics to degrading Iran's military capacity and damaging at least one major nuclear site, and on the other hand continued to give an opportunity to diplomacy, so was not a monger but someone apparently dedicated to peace building and so forth. So Trump could end up in the best of both worlds, not because anyone actually believes that Iran could change or would not betray any deal at a moment's notice, but because for the sake of headlines, the optics would be incredibly good for him. So it's not really clear what's going to happen ultimately, but I do think Trump will try his best to try to get something out of Iran diplomatically before authorizing any military options.
Absolutely, absolutely. But uh, I'm trying to understand for the audience is that no, you see, Iran's role, especially in the last couple of years, is that why does it have to act so belligerent in terms of proxies, in terms of others, when even your air defenses are not working? You keep on talking about nuclear, going nuclear and all. Why would a country take so much of, risk? What do they gain? Now, the leadership is also, in that your scientists are gone, your military leadership is gone, your nuclear capacity about whatever you are planning, that is gone. Your power gets is exposed in front of the world diplomatically, foreign relation wise. How much seriously other nations will also take even your proxies? How would they look at you? Is it, was it worth the risk? Is it worth the risk? How do you salvage your situation? If I understand that leadership has transferred the power to the military, a lot of changes happening. People even are talking about changes in leadership for whatever the way, whatever it happens. We don't know.
Now, Iran's logic may evade most reasonable people, but you have to understand that their logic is not based on rational geopolitical thinking, and their agenda is not purely geopolitical, as for instance is Russia. Russia's, for instance, agenda is very clear. It wants to restore an empire. It wants to colonize countries. It wants to ruin and oppose the West. All of these things are not things we agree with, but they are understandable from a rational perspective, even if we don't like them, agree them, or consider them extremely dangerous line of thinking. Iran's view is different. Iran believes that a profession of its faith is its strongest card, rather than conventional military strength. It may count on a last-minute gamble to salvage its nuclear program. It may be counting on the West giving up after if protracting the war as much as possible, with the hopes that the West will not be able to tolerate extensive destabilization and will try to push Israel to give up, as they have done repeatedly with the war in Gaza, or with Ukraine and Russia. But it could also be that Iran is willing to take the risk of being vanquished in the field, in the hopes that God's will intervene and ultimately guide its success. And you have to also understand that Iran's agenda in the region is ultimately religious. It seeks to become the dominant Muslim power. It seeks to destroy the Saudi monarchy and to become um, the custodian of the two holy mosques, which are currently in Saudi Arabia. To achieve that, it needs to not only survive but to retain the ideological following that it has cultivated through both military activity and ideological activity across the region, including in some of the Sunni majority states um, in the region. And its aggression is part of that agenda. It's a cultivation of all these proxies to accomplish internal goals and to dominate various Middle Eastern states are also part of that approach. Uh, Iran is counting on other people. It has not its regime is corrupt on the one hand, and on the other hand, the exploitation of the revolution and cultivation of all these proxies has taken a heavy toll on its economy, along with the sanctions. And its military is actually quite weak compared to others, poorly equipped compared to, for instance, Saudi Arabia, given how heavily sanctioned the regime is. And that is also why it has to depend on these asymmetrical approaches and hybrid warfare for any to advance its agenda. It is simply not competitive militarily to anybody in the region. Yes, it has a sizable military, but it's poorly trained, it's weak, and even its intelligence agencies are lacking cohesion. They're spying on each other, and they're lacking the significant level of cooperation many other intelligence agencies internationally have. Um, which means that it is facing very significant hurdles and disadvantages compared to Israel, the United States, and other countries, even Middle Eastern countries. Still, the thinking is not, strictly speaking, rational. There is an internal logic to it, but that logic has nothing to do with physical realities. There is also the element of psychological pressure. Iran is willing to bluff and play brinkmanship endlessly, not only on the during its diplomatic efforts and engagement, but also in the military field. Even if it seems to be running out of weapons and opportunities to access those weapons, it still will continue to keep that poker face and pretend that it has more cards than it actually has, because giving up at this point would mean losing any remnants of support it has. And let's face it, its proxies have been recently weakened. Iran has not recovered from the past and very recent intelligence failures and penetration by Israel and internal distrust. It has been quite unstable internally. It has been on the verge of falling before Witkoff reached out to engage in an attempt to at diplomacy. It has put most of its eggs into one basket, this rush to create the nuclear bomb. And it's now gambling once again. It's a very high stakes gambling, its own survival pitted against Trump's willingness to ultimately save the regime for the sake of his own legacy. And we will see what happens with that, of course. But perhaps the regime is sure that at the end of the day, the West cannot be trusted with backing any sort of opposition or transition to a different system. And perhaps the regime figures understand that even if some of their high rollers are sacrificed, the others will replace them, or other factions within the regime will ultimately salvage the legacy, even if there is a significant step backwards as a result of these developments.
Absolutely, absolutely. You are right. Maybe Trump is trying to, create some legacy for himself. At least some papers will report that it is Trump who brought peace into this Iran-Israel conflict. Because in India-Pakistan conflict, he says, nobody is giving me credit here. Maybe there, that will be. But I want to understand, talking of Russia's role here. It said to the US, do not attack Iran. if I understand, in that sense, and then brought in the nuclear word here. What is Russia's role here? And in fact, if I understand, some days back, even Putin had a word with Trump that he can play a role here, but nobody talked about it. Tell us about this whole role about Russia. Is Russia also trying to see that the weapons, perhaps, that it has given Iran, people will see that it's not working there? How would you like to look at all these things and Russia's role here? Has it any role at all here? Because it has relations with Israel also. I just want to understand, means, where does Russia, Russia come in, or it has no role? It's just, using words here.
Well, Russia's relationship with Israel is perfunctory at best. Its relationships are with corrupt government officials, but not with the country as a whole, with some institutions, with some ex Russian oligarchs. Most Israelis don't particularly care for Russia, especially after the October 7th revelations and very public support for Hamas. The intelligence agencies definitely are taking Russia much more seriously than they used to in the past. I think there was a period of time where the intelligence agencies were focused on counterterrorism problems in the 90s, like most Western countries that have given up on the ghosts of the Cold War, only to see them resurrected with Putin's return. So Israel, like many others, has dismantled its understanding of the Soviet regime of Russia and focused on diplomacy and on regional security issues, not this international fight against Russian spies. But I think some of that is starting to return. As far as Russia is concerned, it's in a very weak position. It has just suffered a major setback as a result of Operation Spiderweb. It is losing approximately a million people in Ukraine. It has lost Syria. It's about to lose Iran as an ally. It's losing access to the indispensable Shahid drones that Iran was co-producing with Russia and also producing separately. And Russia has not been a great ally to anybody. It has not been able to save any Assad, nor has it really tried, frankly, except through propaganda. It has not delivered the planes it promised a few years ago to Iran in exchange for its military support. It doesn't have real leverage to put an end to Israel's fighting. Why would Israel listen to Russia over an existential threat? It can, it can send dire warnings to Trump, hoping to play on Trump's sympathies for Putin, but once again, it cannot deliver any substantive result. And it has not been able to put an end to Iran's pursuit of nuclear ambitions because that's frankly Iran's national strategy. And even no matter how close they are with Russia, they're not going to give that up just because Russia asked them to. So Russia's role is very limited, not by choice, but by circumstances and by ground realities, really. The most it can do is wait around and see what happens, but it cannot really help Iran militarily, and politically it is losing leverage rather than gaining it as a result of these developments. It's becoming politically much weaker without Iran and its assistance in the region, especially.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. So let's move on to this whole thing going towards Washington, D.C. They're Trump hosting Pakistan Chief of Army Staff Field Marshal Asim Munir. Does Pakistan has any role there? Why is, suddenly Trump inviting Pakistan General for lunch? What's cooking in there, Irina? Can you tell us about that? Where does Pakistan? Because it's a bit unusual in diplomacy, a president calling in an army chief, and that too for lunch.
Well, there's a couple of things. First, US has been trying to restore its relations with Pakistan after a period that started under Trump, actually, and continued through the Biden presidency, and of cooling relations. Now Trump is praising Pakistan for terrorism-related reforms, for some assistance in certain matters, and also because he sees it as a potential leverage against Iran. It wants to ensure that Pakistan does not provide additional assistance to Iran with its nuclear program. I think that's extremely naive thinking. And after what happened with Kashmir, I actually think that this effort, is going to be misused by the same sort of people who have previously played on U.S. Naive approach to diplomacy in that region. Uh, that said, I'm not sure how much of decision making an army chief in Pakistan is able to do independently from other military factions and senior military leadership. I think this was more to pass on a message than really to engage in a serious diplomacy, and the message probably would have been, um, don't get involved in this. Especially after some news circulated about Pakistan's alleged support for Iran. I don't think they can really do all that much, but they could provide intelligence support. They could provide access to conventional weapons. They can certainly provide, access to fighters, and they have, because Iran has brigades of fighters from Pakistan and Afghanistan, Shia groups that they've recruited. So perhaps the message was stay out of it or help us, and we'll make it worth your while. Um, all of that is possible, especially given that Pakistan has apparently also obtained Israeli defense weapons and cyber weapons in the past. And maybe Trump is trying to basically say, you have a future with Israel because Israel's not going anywhere, but the Iranian regime may be out, and then you'll be out of luck. You won't have allies left. Your future is with us. It's maybe just as simple a message as that. But
Absolutely. Right, carry on. Carry on.
But coming from the president, from the top person, that is the only way to ensure that the Pakistanis will take it seriously. Because, quite frankly, I think Trump is on the outs with many of his own cabinet, and a lower level meeting would probably not have the same impact.
Absolutely. And how do you think India would be reading this? Officials in the foreign ministry, especially in the diplomacy circles, would be reading this particular thing or not reading at all?
I think there is a concern that the US is not taking seriously Pakistan's recent violations and its role in the Kashmir attacks, because while US has called for de-escalation and expressed its sympathy to India and probably lent some level of assistance against the local terrorists, we have not seen any serious pressure on Pakistan other than through statements. And I think India is concerned that US will continue to let it slide for the sake of trying to co-opt Pakistan in some capacity to do business. I mentioned the minerals deal. I think it's very unlikely to actually come to fruition, but I think it's something that US is likely to pursue, even if unsuccessfully. And if Pakistan gives an opportunity to build a Trump Tower, in Karachi or somewhere, I'm not sure the administration will be able to pass that on. We've seen that with Vietnam and other smaller regional players, and I think uh, that is something that we should keep in mind. Do I think that US will have the same level of closeness with Pakistan it once enjoyed in the 80s? No way. I really don't think it's possible. I think the intelligence agencies are quite aware of where Pakistan is at these days, and I think there's a lack of trust on many levels. But do I think that for the sake of business diplomacy and Trump's ambitions, there could be some efforts to engage with Pakistan and get something out of it, some deals? I think it's possible. I don't think it will really be too much to the US benefit, but it could be an attempt to get easy wins, for the sake of public to say, oh well, here we are restoring our relations and making peace. And there's been also an undercurrent of gossip about allegedly bringing Pakistan into the Abraham Accords with Israel. And Pakistan has played both sides of that equation for several years now, sending signals, sending delegations, appearing, occasionally willing to engage in some track two capacity. I don't think they're going to go through with it. But I do think that they're dangling this as a way to re-engage with the US, gain economic support, gain operational and training military support. So I wouldn't rule that sort of engagement out.
Absolutely, absolutely. As Trump is having lunch with the Pakistani general, Allah courts are taking, a different view about all this, bringing in Marines and National Guard to suppress violent riots in various parts. Means, how do you look at that part? Is Trump succeeding at home, not succeeding at home? Is it 50-50, lost less than 50? How do you think? Is he bothered? He is not bothered.
I think right now, if Trump can pull off this thing with Iran, a lot of a lot of his domestic troubles, and there are serious signs of trouble, are going to fade into the background. Trump is seriously concerned about the possibility of impeachment and about losing ground to the Democrats in Congress. At the same time, he is also withholding endorsement of Republicans in key races with the hope of, gaining more leverage in those districts. I don't know whether that strategy will ultimately backfire against him. There are serious concerns about the economy, which keeps shrinking, the impact of tariffs, and the impact of his unpredictable rhetoric about Iran on the oil markets in particular, which could be to the advantage of the oil industry, but not necessarily in the interest of everybody else who's not involved in that field. There are real problems. He's also faced a number of judicial setbacks on some of his key efforts, and now the Federal Reserve too is refusing to lower rates, which means no reset for the economy at the expense of inflation. Um, he there's a share of very serious domestic criticisms. Now there are protests all over the country. They're giving Trump an opportunity to play the strong leader, but I don't think that approach is working with anybody but his base. Um, there are some violent factions in those protests that are not themselves, not covering themselves in glory, and I think that's frustrating a lot of the people who are tired of violent protests that have started years ago during COVID and have not really stopped. And every time there's some new reason and some new excuse, no matter who is in power. But I do think that overall, Trump is not enjoying the previous level of support. And I think many of the people who switched their support from the Democrats for him have been sorely disappointed on many levels. I think we are going to see a very different outcome in the incoming elections if the Democrats manage to develop some sort of a plan and strategy that does not rely simply and only on criticizing Trump, but have some sort of an independent pathway that is appealing to many average Americans. So far, that hasn't happened. So the blue wave may not be as big as people are counting on either. That remains to be seen.
Absolutely, and especially you see this whole Musk and Trump's pact, and then after getting back together. But what about that Doge mess? That is still in very much there, and who he has to fix it. Musk is not going to fix it. Where does that leave him? Because that is also one thing that has brought in a lot of attention from the world, also within United States, obviously.
Let's remember that the spat with Musk started over Trump's spending bill in Congress, a $5 trillion bill filled with, boondoggles like the Golden Dome, which does not appear to be in any way related to the real and urgent defense needs. There's assorted programs that are of dubious use. There's programs related to in trying to encourage higher birth rates, and frankly they're both too little and too much at the same time. They're too little in the sense of giving women a few $1,000s per child is not going to solve the problem. It's just really a fraction of the money needed to raise a child, not to mention everything else. But on the other hand, it's too much in the terms of the fact that all of these sums ultimately add up and heavily inflate the budget. So they're both costly and ineffective at the same time. And there's a lot of similar programs, and nobody even really knows what's in there to begin with. So all of that is very similar to the sort of high spending that the Democrats were criticized for. There is attempts to slash the defense budget in some areas while inflating it others. There's an effort to preserve the entitlements without any serious reforms. None of that is looking very good. Trump, the deficit looks higher, US economy is shrinking, and US is losing credit rating because the economy is shrinking, it's not growing, thanks to all the other messes. The Doge situation has not helped. It has not actually saved any money. If anything, now US has to rehire some of the workers that were fired because we don't have enough people to do the jobs adequately. So we are facing actually probably minimal savings on programs that were, some of them were actually beneficial and others could have been easily reformed without being fully cut. Well, actually, a huge growth of expenses, much more serious expenses elsewhere, comparatively speaking. So all of this Doge thing turned out to be propaganda that ultimately did not solve any of the problems.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's move on from there to Russia to the Baltics. You were there in Latvia just a few days back. What is happening there? Why is Russia so interested in the Baltics after Ukraine, which is where it's already in a very different position, difficult position, if we may use that word. Help us understand what's happening there in there. Do we see or are we going to see another front opening up for the world, the Ukraine war, then the Middle East, and so many other and the Baltics?
I was just in Europe. I was just in the Baltics. The day a major conference by NATO on strategic communication started, Russia's threat to not withdraw from Ukraine until NATO gives up the Baltics came through. Obviously, nobody ran to withdraw at the moment, but the signal was that Russia is counting on not prevailing in Ukraine quickly, but now it's using its presence there as leverage, regardless of the ultimate victory, and it's willing to sacrifice as many people as needed just to have the democracy sword over the Europe's head, and it's also willing to threaten um, other problems in Europe just to get what it wants, and it's very much pushing the envelope on European indecisiveness and shortage of capacity and failure to integrate properly to advance its goals in the short term before Europeans finally wake up and take the measures necessary to contain and reverse roll back Russia's influence. I think many in Europe are expecting a full-fledged war of some sort, or at least significant asymmetric escalations in various parts of Europe, and some of it has already been ongoing and growing in intensity. And it's not, I think it's something to be taken seriously. Russia is a very weak military power, but you know what? If there's no political will to seriously oppose it, if the Europeans are hiding behind each other's back or behind the United States or whatever, and not willing to take the sacrifices necessary to put an end to this problem once and for all, Russia will try to push through whatever ways it can, even if they're not for a full-scale invasion. Even if it's things that are short of that, it will still try to take advantage of the situation and do what it can to sow chaos, to sow discord, to weaken these countries, and to gain a foothold of some sort.
Absolutely, absolutely. And from there, let's move on to our last topic of the day, the G7 meeting. What are the key takeaways? Trump was missing Russia here. Also, he mentioned, if I understand, once India Canada ties. Do you think it's no? There was a bit of a reset chance here, but then the intelligence agencies, Canada's intelligence agency says India is a perpetrator of war and influence interference and puts a lot of countries into that bracket. Help us break that down, all those things. Lots are happening there, from G7 to Prime Minister Modi's visit to Canada, all these things.
I mean, I do think that India was hoping for a restart with Canada, with a new leadership, which is, seems to be a little bit more serious than Trudeau. But you have to understand that Carney is China's man. Carney has enabled China the entire time, and all of that is thanks to Trump's interference in Canadian elections. If not for Trump, we probably could have seen a much more genuine and full rapprochement between the two countries under the conservative leadership, and the intelligence agencies would not be playing these games, and they would be focusing on the real threat to Canadian sovereignty, which is China. Um, Unfortunately, thanks to Trump's influence, this is not to be. And while some of the relations could improve, you cannot expect Carney and the liberals to really deliver the sort of more substantive realignment that um, their opponents were expected to accomplish. As far as Trump is concerned, he left early, and some believe that the real reason he left early was not to deal with the Iranian crisis, which, after all, is being mostly managed by Israel and by generals, um, but in order to avoid meeting with Zelensky, who was literally seated in Trump's seat upon arrival a few hours after Trump left. The fact that he is trying to push Russia to return to G8 right as Russia keeps attacking civilian targets in Ukraine and killing more people is as shocking as if Trump tried to bring Iranians into some international forum while Iranians are raining missiles on Israeli cities and threatening a nuclear war. All of that is astounding cognitive dissonance. You can't separate Iran from Russia at this point. They're jointly together, they're cooperating on military and intelligence and logistics and all sorts of programs. They're profoundly anti-Western, and they're not friends of the United States or of Donald Trump, for that matter. If anything, Russia is using him to restore its financial situation and circumvent sanctions, but you know it does not necessarily see him as a friend or an ally in any real sense. So Trump's signals are all wrong. They're contradictory. They're causing mass confusion, and they're not helping him gain support from Europe on key priorities, because although Europe sees Iran and its nuclear program as a threat, it sees Russia as an existential and immediate threat, and without getting US assistance, it cannot be expected to also refocus its attention on lesser threats like Iran.
Absolutely. So, how much do you think there will be a sort of, getting back to the bonhomie like earlier? How much that is possible between India and Canada with the recent meetings, or whatever the relation with the present Canadian administration with China, but with India they have met, and there seems to be some movement. How much movement that will happen, we'll see. But what is your assessment of this, Irene?
I think there will be some improvement because Carney is a little bit more over seasoned political player who I think he takes his issues more responsibly, and I do think he is more popular than Trudeau was. Not only because he's standing up to Trump, but also simply because he's just a better politician. But I do think that security issues will ultimately limit how close India and Canada can get. I think the fact that China is playing such a big role in Canadian political ecosystem is going to be a problem. I think the fact that the intelligence agencies under liberal leadership are going to be, pulling the same card with political interference against India is for entirely ideological reasons, and also because of China's involvement is also going to be a problem. I think on a personal level, there's probably going to be an improved relationship between the two leaders, but on an institutional level, I think there's going to be limitations that are going to be very difficult to surpass fully.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one last thing, I can't help but asking about this whole thing about Greta Thunberg in Israel. Means I thought it was all about she was all about climate change. Was there a climate issue down there in Israel that and she was deported? Help us understand what's her role down there in Gaza in Israel.
I think the biggest climate issue in Israel was the hot air that she brought with her, and the gas. To be honest, because outside that there was absolutely no reason for her being there. I she I think was looking for a way to stay relevant, just as most of the international community is shifting to other priorities. Climate change is still too big of an issue in Europe because so much money has been invested in it. But now with Russia becoming and even China becoming more prominent geopolitical concerns, I think the attention is shifting to other issues. And Greta was afraid of losing relevance and being forgotten. At the same time, I think some of the extreme environmental activists are also the same types of people who are likely to support Hamas. There, a lot of these people are ignorant, unprepared, emotionally easy to manipulate, and in some cases just have ideologically radical views. And I think Greta is one of those ideologues. And I think she jumped on an opportunity to see herself as a savior, just as she was previously a savior of the environment. She wants to be seen as a leader and a savior of the Palestinians without really knowing much about the conflict. I think whatever she thinks her knowledge base is based entirely on online propaganda and things she's heard, but has not seriously scrutinized and examined. Um, and I think deporting her was an easy thing to do. Frankly, she probably could have gotten killed had she gone to Gaza, and then everyone would have blamed Israel for failing to keep her safe. Alternatively, if she had hooked up with some Hamas operatives and give them free propaganda through her own exposure, that also would not have served Israel well, because Greta still has a lot of sympathy among young people in Europe over the climate change issue, and she still has credibility. And for whatever reason, people think that if someone has credibility and sympathy on one issue, they have to be equally legitimate on everything else. That's a common fallacy, but unfortunately, it's there. And I think just the propaganda value of seeing that she was not violently handled, that she was politely asked to return, and given an opportunity to educate herself about the nature of the conflict, and she rejected that effort. She rejected watching the full documentary about Hamas atrocities on October 7th. I think that exposed a lot of who she is and what she really stands for.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. When she came into prominence, if I understand, she was in school. Now it's a different sort of schooling, perhaps. We'll have to keep watching how the world is changing. A lot of things are happening in the world. A lot of, sense you try to bring of all these happenings every 2 weeks. So with this, it's set up on this very special edition of The World According to Irina Tsukerman. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here as always.